Hello and welcome to another lecture. In this lecture, I will teach you everything you need to know about the traditional versus the modern square of opposition. The square of opposition is a logical device that looks like a chart that uses Venn diagrams to represent the four categorical forms that we have learned before: A, E, I, and O. And the square of opposition shows the logical relations that hold among the four different forms. It looks like this. And as you can see, there are different labels. So for example, the relation between A and O and the relation between E and I is a relation according to which if one of these pairs is true, the other one must be automatically false. So these pairs, A and O and E and I, are called contradictories. Contradictory statements have opposite truth values. So if all bananas are yellow is true, it must be false that some bananas are not yellow. And if it's true that no bananas are yellow, then it must be false that some bananas are yellow, and vice versa. The next relation is the relation between the statement A and an E statement. A and E are in a relation of contrary. So there are contraries statements, contraries forms. They cannot both be true according to this relation, and it is possible that they're both false. They may both be false, but they don't automatically are false. So what I mean is the following. For example, if I say that all judges are lawyers, if this is true, if A is true, it must be false that no judges are lawyers. So as you can see, they cannot both be true. However, if, as we know, some judges are lawyers and some judges are not lawyers, this would make both A and E false. At the bottom, their respective particular statements, I and O, they stand in a different relation. They are subcontraries. Subcontraries cannot both be false, but they may both be true. For example, if I say that some bananas are yellow, or let's say some bananas are green, this we know that it is false. Okay? So if it is false that some bananas are green, obviously the statement that some bananas are not green must be true. It cannot be false. So I and O cannot both be false, but it's possible that they're both true. The next relation is a relation known as subalternation. Subalternation is the relation between the universal statement and its corresponding subaltern. So in the case of A, proposition I, the I form is the subaltern particular of A. And this relationship says that when we start at the top, when we start from the universal statement, any universal statement, any true universal statement logically implies the truth of the particular statement. So one way that I learned when I was in school is that truth always goes down and never goes up. It always goes down. So if it's true that all bananas are yellow, it must be true. It's not just a possibility, but it must be true. It must follow by logical necessity that some bananas are yellow. Now, as you can see, if I, on the other hand, start with a true particular, and I say that it is true that some bananas are yellow, as you can see, it would be impossible to infer from the truth of some bananas are yellow that all bananas are yellow. Therefore, the truth only goes down. This applies obviously to form E and form O. The next relation is a relation known as superalternation. So this says that the falsity of the subaltern implies the falsity of the superaltern. So if it's false that some bananas are yellow, then it must be false that all bananas are yellow. And once again, it's not the other way around. If it's false that all bananas are yellow, it doesn't mean that it's false that some bananas are yellow, because some bananas could be yellow. Now, the final thing that I wanted to say about the traditional square of opposition is that according to traditional interpretation of the four categorical forms, the universal statements, notice that they have an X. The X is the existential import or the existential assumption. This means that according to the traditional interpretation, the universal statements A and E, universal forms A and E, make an existential claim. What existential claim? Well, they claim that the subject class contains some members, because remember that X in logic means some, and some means at least one. In other words, the way to interpret the universal statements according to the traditional interpretation is by saying that, for example, let's take the A form. The A form says that there are in existence at least one member of the subject class. Now, so if I say, for example, that the subject class is bananas and the predicate class is yellow things, so all bananas are yellow things, A form states that there exist bananas in the world. There is at least one banana in the world. And all of them are yellow things. Similarly, the E form also makes an existential statement. It says, there really exist bananas in the world, and not even one of them is a yellow thing. Now, naturally, you notice that I form and the O form also have x's in the diagrams because of obvious reasons, because they are particular statements, so they require an x. The x cannot be taken away. Sum SRP, that's the only way to diagram such a statement. Sum must be diagrammed by an x, and sum S are not P also must be requires an x. Okay, so now the traditional square of opposition enables us to determine, as I just illustrated a minute ago, many logical relations and make inferences among the four categorical forms. But these relations, once again, depend on whether we make the existential assumption or the existential import. So, for example, an A-form statement asserts that all members in the category of the subject are members of the category of the predicate. So if the subject is Martians and the predicate is blonde, then the A-form asserts that all Martians are blonde. But not only that, it makes an existential statement. It says there exist Martians and they're all blonde. And as I also stated, the E-form makes a similar, not similar, the same assumption. It says there exist Martians and not even one of them is blonde. So according to the traditional interpretation, to say that all Martians are blonde means that Martians exist. And according to the same interpretation, a traditional, the E-form is also implies that Martians exist, that whatever entities that are described by the subject class, they do exist. They are in existence. They're things that really exist. Now, while the traditional interpretation implies an existential assumption, the modern interpretation does not make that assumption. The modern interpretation, rather, does not commit to the existence of the members of the subject class. So, according to the modern interpretation, A and E do not assert that the member of the subject class really exists. So what do they assert? The modern interpretation makes a hypothetical statement. The modern interpretation says that the universal statements are hypothetical. So how do we read an A-form statement, for example? We have to interpret it as stating that if anything is a Martian, then it is blonde. So if anything is a Martian, if anything like Martians exist, the A-form statement says that all of them are blonde. And the E-form says that if anything is a Martian, no one, not even one of them, is blonde. So the question obviously is, why do we use the modern square? Why did they even invent the modern square of opposition? Well, first of all, you should note that on the traditional interpretation, the universal statements are true only when the members of the subject class really exist. So, if members of the subject class do not exist, then the universal statements A and E cannot be true, because remember that the X inside the universal statements in the diagrams implies that there exists some members of the subject class. But if an A statement or an E statement is false, then its contradictory, O or I, is also false. You see, if I say that all Martians are blonde, according to the traditional interpretation, the one that has an X that makes an existential assumption, the A statement would be false, because it is false that there exist Martians and all of them are blonde. So the A proposition would be false. But remember that the relation between an A form and an O form is of opposite truth values. Remember that they cannot have the same truth value. So if A is false, O must be true. But O cannot be true, because there aren't any Martians. So it would be false as well. Some Martians are not blonde would be false. But contradictories cannot both be false. So this would be a problem. So this is the first problem why modern logicians decided that the traditional square of opposition gives us some problems. So for modern logicians, the traditional square is limited, essentially, because we also need to be able to make some assertions about things that don't exist. For example, when we talk about dinosaurs or Martians or triangles, we don't want to say that these entities really exist in real life and they are related to other categories in certain ways. For example, when I say that all triangles are geometrical shapes that have only 3 straight sides and 3 angles and 180 degrees and all that stuff, I do not intend to mean that there exist in the world actual triangles. Well, we know that triangles don't really exist. There are things that are that resemble triangles, but nothing really has 3 exactly straight sides and 3 angles. Also, if I say that all dinosaurs are extinct, I don't mean that there exist dinosaurs and they're all extinct, because I would be making an absurd claim. So now the obvious strategy would be to rescue the traditional interpretation of the square of opposition by using the square only for certain entities and not for others, namely the entities that do exist. But here's the problem. What are we going to do about the following statement? All shoplifters are prosecuted to the full extent of the law. This is a very curious statement because the statement describes certain entities. Okay, so the members, in other words, the members of the subject class, namely the shoplifters, are things that do exist, in fact, in reality. They're not like triangles or angels or whatnot. Shoplifters do exist. However, the statement that I just made, that all shoplifters are prosecuted to the full extent of the law, is true only if the category of the subject, the shoplifters, is empty. So this is really puzzling because it's not that only that we need to make statements about things that don't exist and make sense of them, but we also need to make statements about things that do exist, and yet we would make a wrong statement, a false statement, by diagramming that statement according to the traditional square of opposition, which makes an existential assumption. That would be the X. So, all shoplifters are prosecuted to the full extent of the law. As you can see, according to the traditional interpretation, if A is true, if my statement is true, my statement is false, because if it's true that all shoplifters are prosecuted, then the subject class must be empty, because all of them are prosecuted, and consequently there would be 0 shoplifters inside the class of shoplifters. So the traditional interpretation of A asserts that inside the class shoplifters there are some, at least one, shoplifters, while at the same time it denies that there are any. And this is a big problem. This is a big problem. Therefore, the traditional interpretation, as I said, doesn't work for multiple reasons. One, because it doesn't work for abstract entities or imaginary entities, Santa Claus, leprechauns, Martians. But also it doesn't work for actual entities such as shoplifters or dinosaurs that, well, in a sense, do exist. But let's leave aside dinosaurs because that's a different story. Let's talk about the shoplifters that do exist, but as I just illustrated, they should not be there in the subject class. So what's the solution? Well, modern logicians think that traditional interpretation must be abandoned. So let's now develop the modern version of the square of opposition. What does that mean? It means that in order to develop the modern square of opposition, we no longer interpret the universal A and E statements as existential statements. And by doing that, we need to remove the existential import, which is the X. Remove it from A and E. So this is what it looks like. Now, as we will see, I don't want to anticipate, I don't want to jump the gun, but contradictories are the only relations that are preserved in the modern square of opposition, and let me show you why. So now that we have removed, as you can see, the X's from the universal statements, Remember that now we read the universal statements as hypotheticals. So A would be if the members of the class of the subject exist, they're all members of the predicate class. And E states that if there exist members of the subject class, whichever those might be, not even one of them is also a member of the predicate class. So let's use again our example of all shoplifters are prosecuted. Now you can, as you can see, if there are any shoplifters, they're all prosecuted. Now if this is true, there's no X there, as you can see. So this statement now can't be true. That's the only way to make that statement true, by removing the X. So if this is true, then the contrary O, which does have an X, does make an existential assumption, some shoplifters are not prosecuted, would be false because there aren't any. Similarly, if E is true, then I is false. Okay? So if it's true that no shoplifters are prosecuted, then it must be false that some are prosecuted. Okay? So, in other words, the A and O are still contradictories, and E and I are still contradictories in the modern interpretation. We saved something. However, see what happens with the relation between A and E. A and E, if you recall, are contraries according to the traditional interpretation. This meant that they cannot both be true, but they may both be false. However, if there are no shoplifters in the subject class, the class of shoplifters, A is true because they're all prosecuted. So if I say that all shoplifters are prosecuted, then A is true. But then E is also true because there aren't any shoplifters in the class of shoplifters. There are also members of the prosecuted class. But then A and E are both true, which is by definition impossible, according to the traditional interpretation. Therefore, on the modern interpretation, A and E no longer stand in a contrary relation. They're no longer contraries, because they can both be true. And by the same token, I and O are no longer subcontraries. Remember that subcontraries cannot both be false. Okay? But because I and O statements are particular, by definition, they make an existential assumption. So if I say that all shoplifters are prosecuted, if this statement is true, then guess what? Then the statement that some shoplifters are prosecuted would be false. Why would it be false? It would be false because remember that the I statement makes an existential import or assumption. It says there exist, right here, there exist shoplifters. But if it's true that all shoplifters are prosecuted, there should be nothing here. And because the I form says that there is something here, there are members, at least one member of the class shoplifters is right there inside, then this must be false. And for the same reason that I is false, O is also false, because it says, guess what? In the class, subject class of shoplifters, there is at least one shoplifter. But if it's true that all shoplifters are prosecuted, right here there should be nothing at all. Consequently, if it's true that all shoplifters are prosecuted, some shoplifters are not prosecuted is going to be false. But that's a big problem, because I and O, according to the traditional interpretation, are subcontraries, which means that they cannot both be false. But as I just demonstrated, they are both false according to the modern interpretation. Consequently, according to the modern interpretation, this relation goes away. I and O are no longer subcontraries. The next relation, if you recall, is a relation that says that the truth of a universal implies the truth of a particular. I mean, it's corresponding particular. So if the superaltern is true, its corresponding subaltern must be true. Or, in other words, if A is true, according to the traditional interpretation, I must be, by logical necessity, true. But this no longer occurs in the modern interpretation. Let me show you why. On the modern interpretation, remember, without the X, the A statement is just a hypothetical statement. So it says that if there exists some members of the subject class, all of them are members of the predicate class. But if it's true, if this is true, then it cannot possibly imply that the I statement is true. Namely, that some members of the subject class in fact exist. After all, A is merely making a hypothetical statement, is saying if there are members of the subject class, then they are all members of the predicate class. But this cannot possibly imply that some members of the subject class in fact exist. Or to give you the same example, if all shoplifters are prosecuted, means that if there are shoplifters, they're all prosecuted. But this statement cannot possibly imply that some shoplifters are prosecuted. And as you can see, if it's true that all shoplifters are prosecuted, it means that there aren't any shoplifters in the subject class. Consequently, if the particular statement I shows an X, it means that it makes an existential claim. It says there are inside the class of the subject shoplifters. But this would be false. So, a true universal does not imply a true particular. I'm talking about the corresponding particular, okay? I'm talking about the superaltern and the subaltern, A and I, and also the relation between E and O, which is going to be the same, okay? So if it's true that no shoplifters are prosecuted, okay, then this does not imply that some shoplifters are not prosecuted. The next is superalternation. Remember, according to superalternation, the falsity of a particular statement implies the falsity of its corresponding universal statement. So, the I statement asserts that there exists some, at least one, members of the subject class. The problem is this: if there are no shoplifters, they're prosecuted. Then the assertion that some shoplifters exist, which is what I asserts, would be false. Okay? So we can have a false I. However, it is still the case that A is true. In other words, if there are shoplifters, all of them will be prosecuted. So, in other words, I just demonstrated that it is possible a combination where I is false and A is true. But because the falsity of I does not imply the falsity of A, and likewise for O and E, these couples no longer exhibit superalternation. Okay? So we can now see from this examination that the only inferences preserved on the modern version of the square of opposition are the inferences of the contradictories. That's all. That's all we can do. So the traditional square of opposition has certain logical problems that modern logicians decided to resolve by removing the existential import, but the price to pay, as we saw, is very high. And this is the end of another lecture. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in the next lecture.